This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to the Comparative Histories of Asia seminar, and this is going to be our last seminar for the term, and Owen is going to be introduced by Andre Yanku, so I'm just going to do a tiny little thing beforehand, which is to award this doctoral presentation prize that we have, because we have instituted 2 doctoral presentation sessions throughout the year where we encourage doctoral students actually from anywhere to apply and give papers. And so this year's winner is Emily Chapman from SOAS. So Emily, congratulations. Yes, you'll be very productive here. So there you are. Yeah, well done. Yeah, thank you.
It's still only one of you.
It feels like there's like 4 of us.
Okay, great. It's going to be a very brief introduction, but I'm really very happy to be able to introduce Owen Miller, who I actually got to know when he just finished his PhD, because I was one of the 2 examiners of his PhD, which for me at the time was quite a challenging thing to do. So it's quite some time ago, probably 2006, 7? 7, right, so that was probably the end of my first year at SOAS, actually. So he was working on Korean merchant guilds at the time, and that, Korea was quite a new thing for me at the time, because I was doing Chinese history and sinology. But what was even more challenging was that the most important source for that thesis was actually accountants' books, which is a source that not many people, I believe, are able to understand. Probably not in other languages, but even less in Korean and classical Chinese, I guess, right? But it's a very tricky thing. I have another friend who's doing similar things, but it's still kind of enigmatic to me. So we managed to go through that, and that was a really interesting thesis, because we normally don't really, many of us don't know a lot about late 19th, early 20th century Korean merchants and their work, and how they cooperated with merchants in other East Asian countries, in particular with China. That was what I found interesting about that. So that's how I knew Owen, and then he's moved on quite a lot since then. So he's done his BA, MA at SOAS, then spent, I actually don't know how much time, but a considerable time in Korea, kind of furthering his knowledge of the Korean language. And after his PhD, he spent some time at Cambridge as a research fellow, and then came back as a lecturer in Korean to SOAS. So it's quite a great career, actually. And he's now, actually one of the other papers I do remember that I found really interesting and fascinating was about the kind of gift exchange and use of tobacco in that context. So there's a paper on that, and a couple of other publications about these really interesting tiny aspects of late 19th, early 20th century Korean, say, social and to some extent political, cultural history. So now this is something that to me is very new again, and probably is your new. I assume that the other project will be published soon as a book, right? I think that's what I heard you say.
It's been soon for quite a long time, but yes, it's still soon.
In the meantime, there's a series of articles that you can refer to if you're curious about that earlier work, and now this I assume is a new project on. As you can see, and I don't have more to say about that, and we will hear from Owen himself about war in the state and the formation of the Korean industrial working class. So,
okay.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I suppose after that introduction, maybe I have to justify, or not justify, but anyway, make some sort of explicit connection between what I was doing previously, which Andrea has kindly introduced, and what I'm doing now. It's a bit difficult to do, actually. In my mind, these things are connected in terms of the economic and social history of modern Korea. I think they are all connected up, but I'm going to struggle to make a case of why exactly I should have been doing something on 19th century merchants a few years ago, and now doing something on industrial working class and proletarianization a few years later. But yes, in some strange way, they are in my own mind certainly connected in a kind of this fairly long-term sort of 150 year process of the Korean Peninsula's entry into the modern capitalist world, and they are different parts of that process, but they're still part of the same process. Anyway, I won't say anything more about anything else about merchants. This paper, I would like to hope that it's part of a new project that I will be starting, but I'm sort of only at the earlier stages because I have too many other things to finish. Anyway, this particular paper is going to be published hopefully soon, in the next few months, or a version of this paper in non-history journal, in Third World Quarterly, more of a kind of development studies journal, I suppose. As I said, I hope it will lead on, to something else, something which I could talk about a bit at the end, maybe if I have time. Where did this paper start from? Well, I think one of the main places it started from, actually, one of the things that prompted this paper was this graphic, which is in this small book of statistics which the Democratic People's Republic of Korea published in 1961, which is the Statistical Returns of National Economy of the DPRK, 1946 to 1960. It's a book of statistics sort of trumpeting the achievements of the early years of the DPRK. Well, what I found interesting about it is the way in which this particular graphic kind of gives a graphic illustration of what the DPRK state thought it was doing or saw itself as doing, and what it saw itself as having achieved, which is a transformation of the class structure of the population from being primarily agricultural. The green dots are peasants. The red dots, not surprisingly, are workers. I'll come on to the blue dots, but anyway, from being a primarily agricultural country full of peasants to being one that basically is sort of 50-50. One half of it is workers or employees, the other half are the blue dots, and they are actually workers on cooperative farms or collective farms. So this is a complete transformation. The question then that arises from this is, how did workers in North Korea become, or how did ordinary people, peasants and other sectors of society become workers in this quite short space of time? What processes brought that about? This is kind of huge transformation for society in a very short space of time, if we take it at face value. I mean, perhaps we don't, perhaps it's not a good idea to take it entirely at face value, but it's, I think it's still a pretty good indicator of what was going on. I don't think there's any huge evidence to the contrary that it's completely wrong. To answer this, I realised really that it would make most sense to have a kind of trans-historical approach, and by that I mean an approach that cuts across colonial and post-colonial Korea. Because, of course, industrialization and the process of making an industrial working class had started under Japanese colonial rule in the 1930s and continued under the DPRK. So this offers a very interesting opportunity to look at a process across this boundary of colonial, post-colonial, and see what stayed the same or what changed. And that's really a lot of what this paper is about. I also think that this period I'm looking at, which goes from the late colonial to the early DPRK up to the first sort of 15 years of the DPRK, that period can be situated also more broadly in the industrialization of the Korean Peninsula, which of course then kind of continued in South Korea from the mid to late 1960s through to, well, you could say through to the present day, but certainly the initial phase of South Korean industrialization under Park Chung-hee is really, I guess, from the mid-60s to the mid-late 70s. So my conceptualization of this is that industrialization of the Korean Peninsula happens in sort of three phases. One is the colonial one, the second one is the post-colonial one under the DPRK, and the third phase is under Park Chung-hee in South Korea. Obviously, they're all they're not continuous. They're geographically and temporally separated, but in other ways, I think they can be seen as part of a broad process of the Korean Peninsula coming into the modern capitalist world, the modern industrial world, and being industrialized. Okay, I'm going to summarize a few things that I'm going to say. What I found, generally speaking then, is that through these two periods, colonial, post-colonial, you see some quite strong similarities. First of all, you see the forced mobilization of workers to alleviate labour shortages in new industries. This is not something that's specific to the Korean Peninsula. It's quite a global phenomenon in both colonial countries and newly industrializing countries and countries at war. I therefore speculate that during this period, the most common route to becoming a worker was through some form of mobilization led by the state, if not necessarily the state doing the mobilization, but at least led by the state. Second thing I would say is that during most of this period, while there was in some cases some very organised resistance from workers and the formation of unions, for a lot of this period, colonial and post-colonial, workers' resistance took other forms in a very highly repressive setting, which included high worker mobility as being one of the key things. Workers voting with their feet, and this is a problem that the North Korean state faced on a huge scale in the 1950s. And that mobility was then countered by the state introducing a very strong labour discipline and very kind of far-reaching bureaucratic measures focused around particularly what I call immobilisation, so the freezing of workers. So mobilisation is one thing, but immobilisation is just as important, if not more important perhaps, which is keeping workers where they are once you've got them there. And then the final thing I think that's important in what I'm going to say is that is to say something about the nature of wage labour itself, and to sort of, I hope, get rid of the idea or remnants of the idea that there's such a thing as free wage labour and that this is associated with the development of industrial societies and capitalism. Actually, my position would be, it's not really necessarily not really my idea, but my position would be that wage labour exists on quite a broad spectrum, from relatively free to relatively unfree, and in circumstances that you find pertaining in the Korean Peninsula in the mid-20th century, it moves pretty decisively towards the unfree end of the spectrum. But it's still, in my opinion, wage labour. We're not talking about some other form of labour like slavery or something. So, just to sum up in what I'm going to say in a round is really that the key factors in proletarianization during this period were the state and war, which, obviously this period encompasses two major wars, either on or around the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about. First thing I'm going to talk about will be just a little introduction to talk about how I situate my work within global labour history. Then I'll give a kind of overview of the process of industrialization. It will be inevitably very brief and very, simplified. And then the main sort of more meaty part of what I'm going to talk about will be two sections. One section on the nature of the making of the working class under colonial rule, and then a section on the making of the working class under the DPRK. Okay, so to say a few things about global labour history and proletarianisation. So when I sort of started out looking at this, I thought to myself, well, there's probably out there huge literature about proletarianisation in the Third World, how people became workers, and how that might be different or similar to what happened in Europe, North America, the general North Atlantic region. Actually, what surprised me is there's not that much that's very explicitly about that process. So I did pay quite a bit of attention to the sort of fairly new stream of what is called global labour history, which I think has been pioneered particularly by Marcel van der Linden, who actually incidentally gave a very interesting IHR talk a few months ago. But anyway, I started by looking at some of the classical passages from Marx, what Marx says about the process of English proletarianization and expropriation of peasants and so on. And it's pretty clear that Marx didn't actually himself put forward this idea of some pure free wage labour, this idea that somehow, peasants are sort of extirpated from their natural setting and then sort of thrown out into the markets to become somehow, just purely sort of commodities in the marketplace. He's pretty clear to say that the state intervenes quite a lot in terms of things like wages and so on. And of course, there are famous phrases in there that this period of proletarianization in English history. Marx's famous phrase was written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. Also, I just mention here in connection with that, I think wonderful book which I've just read recently, which is connected to this, is Linebaugh and Redeker's book, The Many-Headed Hydra. I don't know whether anyone's read that, but it's absolutely fantastic. One of the best works of history I think I've ever read. But in that book, much of that book is, one of the key themes of Many-Headed Hydra is to do with the way in which the sort of Atlantic working class was created by the impressment of men by the Navy, by the British Navy. Okay, so another work that I looked at was one of the few books that's very explicitly about proletarianization in the Third World, which is a book by Munslow and Finch, published in the 80s. And this deals, particularly with proletarianization in the colonies, European colonies. And it very much highlights the role of force in the Third World proletarianization and highlights the role of labour shortages as being the cause of that coercion. And I mean, interestingly, one of the things that leapt out of reading this book for me was the fact that forced labour was still being used in Portuguese colonies until 1961. So the sort of end of the period that I'm looking at with Korea, there's still a period when European countries are, can be said to be using forced labour. And then, in the paper I talk a little bit then about some of the contrasting positions, and I suppose I'm probably, in my analysis there, I'm most favourable towards Jairus Banerjee's work, which has looked at the different forms of labour, during the process of proletarianization and the development of capitalism in new areas of the world. And Banerjee asserts this position that while we can see many different forms of labour with different degrees of freeness or unfreeness, they can all come under the category of wage labour. He makes a very convincing argument that I'm not going to kind of be able to make here anyway. Okay, so some basic propositions behind this article. My first one is that however you want to call, late colonial, Japan or Japanese colonies and the DPRK, whatever you want to call them, whatever labels you want to give them, they were both deeply engaged in certain activities which we would say are very much capitalist, in the sense that they were commodifying labour. They're both deeply engaged in the activity of accumulating capital and producing and reproducing a working class as a means to accumulate capital. Therefore, I think there's a justification in labelling both of them as being state capitalist in their own ways. The second proposition behind this article I've already talked about a bit, actually, so I won't go over it again, but that's to say that there is a kind of a myth of free wage labour as this sort of static category, but actually it's much better to think of it as a spectrum. Okay, let's move on and actually talk about industrialization. This seems to get very dim every so often, or is that just me?
I think probably muted. No? It's lamp dimming mode.
Yeah. Well, maybe
It
when I
will
move
come
to
back, yeah, it will come back again, yeah.
if I move to the next slide.
Oh,
yes.
yes.
Oh, that's better.
Sleeping.
Okay. Right. So I'm going to kind of rattle through overview of industrialization between the beginning of the 1930s and around about 1960. An explicit policy of industrialization began in the Japanese colony of Korea in around about 1931, 1932. And sort of the pivotal events, probably as most people know, would be the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and then of course the Sino-Japanese War beginning in 1937. And as I'm sure most of you know, then the Japanese really saw the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria as this important industrial base for warfare, really, largely. So, they built extensive railway system and started a number of major industrial areas. The two most important ones for what I'm talking about today, I guess, are the sort of area around Pyongyang and the area around this sort of double city of Hanhung-Hunnan. But actually also, further up there, there's no label on it apart from the name, is Chongjin, also another important industrial area with a huge steel complex. And in the 1930s, these new industrial complexes were built by Japanese chaebol with, the support of the Japanese state, of course. So in Hungnam, there was this huge chemical complex built, the biggest, most advanced chemical complex in the world at the time, by Chisol. And then further up the coast, at Chongjin, you have this huge iron and steel complex built by Mitsubishi. So they're just two examples, but there are many other examples. Of course, there was some Korean capital as well involved in building and establishing factories, but it was generally much, much smaller scale. So you can see a very good example of uneven and combined development here. A country that is still overwhelmingly agricultural. In many ways, you might use the term unfashionable and perhaps unfair as it is backward, but it has within it, two or three of the most advanced and largest industrial complexes, at least in Asia, if not in the world, in the 1930s. This industrialization was also driven by hydropower. You maybe not be able to see very clearly, but on this map it marks a number of the huge dams which are built, and North Korea still relies, a lot on hydropower. The biggest one, of course, being this one up here on the Amlok River, Yalu River, rather, if you use the more common pronunciation. Okay, so what does this mean for working class? I'm going to show you a few. In the middle of this talk, I'm going to have a few fairly boring tables with lots of numbers in them, but so you'll have to cope with that. This are figures, I believe, that Professor Sun-won Park drew from Japanese colonial official statistics of their survey in 1930 of the working population, and it shows at the beginning, or even just before the period that I'm talking about, a very informal working class. The kind of working class that you might expect to have seen in England in Marx's time, dominated by domestic servants and day labourers, casual, kind of very informal working class. Very small number of factory workers and mine workers and so on. 80% of the population of this time was still in agriculture, dominated by a landlord class. But of course this changes with the development of all those industrial areas I showed you on the previous map. And so you can see then that by this time, during the wartime in fact, you have, by this time, quite a substantial industrial working class of factory workers, mine workers, transportation workers, and so on. Obviously, you have a figure here of 1.75 million. You'll probably look at the figures I show you during this and think, these figures don't make sense. The biggest problem with looking at the figures I've looked at is that obviously different people measure different things and use different categories, and therefore you end up with figures that don't really match up very nicely. But anyway, the takeaway figure here, I suppose, is 1.75 million out of the total Korean population, which I'm struggling now to think what the Korean population was in 1945. Maybe 30 million? 25 million? 25 million. Okay, I'll come to this in a minute. So, what happened after this? I'll say one other thing about this before I finish with this. Alongside the growth, the quantitative growth in the working class during this period, you also see some quite major qualitative changes of various types. One of the most significant ones is that you see a sort of masculinization of the workforce during this period. In the earlier period, in the 1920s, you'd had a lot of textile industry and dominated by a female workforce, and as industry moves towards heavy industry, you see a change towards a more male workforce. You also see a shift towards industrialization in the northern part of the peninsula, which was related to the Japanese sort of general strategy, but that also meant a lot of migration was going on. So already before the liberation in 1945, you had this big movement of the Korean population, with lots of people moving from the south and north for work. I'll talk about that again in a minute. Okay, so after obviously 1945, liberation from Japanese colonial rule, and then immediate occupation by the US and Soviet armies. In the north then, that essentially means the de facto industrialization of all this Japanese industry that's concentrated in the north, and that becomes legal nationalization in the summer of 1946 under the emerging government of Kim Il-sung. I'm going to skip ahead now. The Korean War. The Korean War was massively devastating to the North Korean economy. And the main reason it was hugely devastating was the US aerial bombardment. Very few countries in the 20th century have been so comprehensively devastated and flattened as North Korea was in the period 1950 to 1953. After the war, then, there was a huge reconstruction, a sort of Marshall Plan for North Korea, carried out, led by the Soviets, obviously, but carried out also a lot by Eastern European countries, particularly East Germany, who were sort of lent on by the Soviets and told, go and help them reconstruct various bits of their country. And by the Chinese as well, who actually left very large numbers of Chinese troops in the country for a number of years after the end of the Korean War. Partly they were useful in terms of providing manpower for the reconstruction of the country. The post-war period also saw the bringing in of a series of Soviet-style multi-year plans and a really dogged focus, I think, led by Kim Il-sung and people around him, not necessarily by the whole of the Korean Workers' Party. There are people who were in opposition to him, but the dogged focus from Kim Il-sung on building up heavy industry. So you can see bringing over already from the late colonial period the same kind of focus on heavy industry. There's a lot of debates around that topic. I probably I don't have time to go into all of that, but a lot of people would argue actually that was quite common. It's not unique to North Korea, Eastern European countries as well. all modelled themselves on the Soviet Union in the 1930s, essentially. We all have to become an all-round economy with, we have to be able to manufacture everything from clothes to, tractors to ships and whatever. Now, this period did see absolutely massive growth rates and huge expansion of industry. Some years there were growth rates in the 30 and 40% annual growth, which of course is possible when you're starting from a very low base post a devastating war. Okay, let me show you. What did this mean for the growth of the working class? These figures are taken again from this book. Again, I'm making the assumption that it's at least relatively reliable, not complete nonsense, which I don't think it is. I don't think there's any reason really for it to be. And so you can see then, starting from the low after the war, 1953, you can see just how quickly, rapidly the size of the working class grows there. I haven't put the headline figure on this slide, I don't think. No. But the headline figure they give in here for the number of workers in the economy in 1960 is 1.45 million, which is out of the North Korean population, obviously, which is around 10 million. So, obviously, a very, very large increase in the size of the industrial working class. And also of employees generally, because when you build this kind of economy, you have to build quite a large bureaucracy, and obviously all these people become essentially a sort of worker as well. Okay, right, I'm now going to talk about the actual process of how people became workers. So, slightly chronologically chaotic talk, but I'm going to go back to talking about the colonial period. So, how did the state first come to intervene in making workers? Well, from very early on in the early 1930s, it is reported that there were considerable labour shortages. And one of the ways that the state intervened early on, very lightly really, was more in a propaganda way, to encourage people to migrate to the north where there are jobs, to just sort of use persuasion rather than anything more coercive. But by that, they did already in the 1930s, you did see the initiation of a kind of migratory system of labour and seasonal labour, of people moving around the Korean Peninsula from the south to the north to work in factories and back down to the south again, to their hometowns. But a much stronger form of state intervention in earnest, began in with the time of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937, and particularly from 1938 onwards. And at this point, then, you see three different types of labour mobilisation coming into play. The first one, sort of the lightest touch, really, is a company-directed recruitment system, which gets the backing of the state in various different forms, both formal and informal. There's an interesting book on this whole topic, published only a couple of years ago by Brandon Palmer, which looks at all different forms of mobilisation of Koreans by the Japanese state. And he talks about the way in which, this kind of mobilisation could take both formal and informal forms. The local, perhaps, for example, a company could have connections with the local police station or something, who could go out around the villages and help to encourage people to sign up to work for a company and so on. The second type of mobilisation was government-directed recruitment. This is where the government actually takes over the employment offices and actually begins to directly recruit workers for enterprises. And then finally, from 1942 onwards, you have actual labour conscription. This obviously is a much more coercive type of recruitment. essentially the state would go around to local governments and say, you need to fill this quota for these people, we need X number of workers, and then it would be down to whatever other local people, the local village headman, or to the other notaries, or to the police to go around and actually find these people and round them up. Actually, under labour conscription, the much more common form of conscription was what we might call freezing or immobilisation of workers. So workers who were already working for Chiso up in Hungnam or for Mitsubishi, they would have to stay where they are. They couldn't move, right? So any system of migratory labour would have to come to an end, and people couldn't just walk in and out of their jobs. Once they were in a job, they had to stay there. And they had to obviously establish some sort of bureaucratic apparatus for enforcing that, which used things like labour passports, which mean you can't get another job until without having a sort of exit stamp or whatever it happens to be from your previous place of employment, and you can get, I guess they have to work on things like getting comments or bad marks in your passport if you've skipped out on jobs and so on. So this is the way in which labour in the late colonial period becomes increasingly sort of unfree. Okay, I've got something here just to say something a little bit about the scale of mobilisations. According to Brandon Palmer's book, under this government-directed mobilisation and the labour conscription mobilisation, during the period which they're active, from the end of the 1930s to 1945, you see almost 1 million mobilisations under those systems of Koreans within Korea. Now, that doesn't mean that's 1 million people who were peasants who became workers. It's not, obviously, very much more complicated than that. And actually, each mobilisation is not a one person. I mean, each mobilisation is one mobilisation, not a person who's been mobilised multiple times. It's also worth mentioning there are other kinds of mobilisation in the late colonial period. There are very common forms of temporary mobilisation to do various kinds of works. In a way, quite reminiscent, having been someone who studied pre-modern history in the Chosun period, quite reminiscent of corvée labour, which of course you find in most pre-modern states. But yes, this kind of thing organised under bodies such as the patriotic units, Egukban or Aikokuhan. And there are some over 4 million mobilisations of that type in the same period of 38 to 45. But this would mean people going to work on a road or going to fix something or being organised into work teams to do that kind of thing. Again, it has echoes later under DPRK. Okay, move on. How am I doing for time? Okay, I need to wrap up for you soon. So, we're going to talk about what happened under the DPRK. I won't talk about the period 45 to 50. I'm sure there's quite a lot that could be said about that period, but the mobilisation of workers in earnest starts with the beginning of the Korean War. And the war itself, just as the Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War was, the Korean War becomes this huge exercise in mobilising the population. And, it's only a part of the population that's actually mobilised to fight. The larger part of the population is mobilised to work, basically. So the first thing to mention, of course, is that the Korean War caused huge, labour shortages. So you see that the number of industrial workers in North Korea, already in the first year of the war, dropped to 82% of its pre-war level. 1951, it drops to 62%. And then by 52, clearly mobilisation efforts are working a little bit, and it comes back up to 74%. But all the way through, there are shortages of workers. And this required, as far as the DPRK state was concerned, a mass mobilisation. And, of course, what they did was quite similar, at least superficially, to the Japanese labour conscription system. One thing that's different, and I think is quite important here, is that in the DPRK case and during the Korean War, it meant mobilising very large numbers of women to come into the industrial workforce. That's not to say that women weren't mobilised in all kinds of ways, and very infamous ways, by the Japanese colonial state, but during the Korean War, women were mobilised specifically to go and work in industry. I think I have a picture here. Oh yes, here we go. This is a picture by famous French filmmaker Chris Marker, who visited North Korea in the 1950s after the Korean War. He produced this amazing photo book of images, which are so different to images produced by the DPRK state. There's such different images. Anyway, I'm not going to say one is the sort of true North Korea and one is not, but they're just very, very different kind of picture. So after armistice in 1953, July 1953, the North Korean state was faced with an ongoing labour shortage and a very chaotic situation in the factories by all accounts because of huge amount of mobility of workers. And I suppose when you've mobilised huge numbers of workers and then the war ends and they want to go back to where they came from, or so there's this sort of just this churn of workers. And basically the state continued its wartime policies essentially, and actually even strengthened them into the post-war period. So under the multi-year plans that began in 1954, the State Planning Commission would centrally calculate the number of workers that were required in each sector of the economy. Then the Ministry of Labour would assign those workers to individual enterprises, and presumably, I don't know yet the exact mechanism, but presumably at the ground level, then these workers were recruited and sent to those enterprises in local areas, presumably by local government bodies like the People's Committees, which operated in towns and villages. Many of the workers coming into factories after the war were actually discharged soldiers. So they kind of transitioned directly from military mobilisation into a post-war labour mobilisation. A second large group of new workers after the war came from the peasant class, and this was particularly driven by the process of collectivisation or cooperativization, which occurred in the 1950s at quite high speed in North Korea, which by all accounts did produce a surplus of workers who could then go into cities and industrial areas. I did put one more picture up just to show. This is from North Korean. I suppose it's a North Korean photo book from the 1950s. I'm not going to say it's a propaganda photo book because, but it was just another photo that included a woman worker actually, which was quite interesting. But although, of course, in this case, the worker is very, very small in the vastness of this factory. The slogan at the back in this picture is very interesting as well. It's basically a slogan you would never, ever in a million years see in North Korea today. And it says, basically, the sort of manse, long live the eternal friendship between the Korean people and the Soviet people. So I was going to... Yes, next slide. This one I wanted to show you because, again, this is one of these nice visualizations that the North Korean Statistical Board produced in 1961 to show you very simply how the entire agricultural sector became collectivized. 100% cooperative farms by 1958. There's something very, very neat about these visualizations which would make most people feel a bit suspicious maybe, but anyway, that's how they decided to illustrate it. So yes, collectivization, cooperativization is another driver of proletarianization in a sense, or at least a way of producing workers for new industry. Other groups of people in this period who became workers apparently were people who didn't really have a place in the new social system. People like handicraft people, small businessmen who had existed up until the Korean War, but after the Korean War or during the Korean War were kind of disappeared, not necessarily through state action, but perhaps through the destruction of their businesses by the war. And during this period in the late 1950s, also the state recruited heavily from people who were graduating from school or university, well, mostly from school. Finally on this then, again, the North Korean state, like the Japanese colonial state, had to have a bureaucratic apparatus to not just enforce its mobilization, but to enforce its immobilization of workers once they were in factories. This is an image I managed to find of the North Korean labour passport, Nodong Sutok, which I believe North Korean workers still have to have, or something like it anyway. And inside it contains lots of information about your, it's kind of like a CV, but lots of information about your different jobs and when you've had time off and maybe when you've been late or you've been absent without permission and so on. So this was a way, to immobilise workers. It became a criminal offence to leave one's workplace in the mid-1950s without getting the necessary permission through this means. And as I said, there's a remarkable resemblance to the Japanese system, although I think it would be wrong to argue that it's borrowed directly from the Japanese system. Of course, the Soviet Union also had kind of a similar way of organising its workers, and actually quite a number of other countries had as well, so it's nothing particularly uniquely North Korean about it. Before I conclude, I just wanted to show you a couple of other pictures of how workers, the new vigorous working class of North Korea in the 1950s has been depicted. This is a picture showing the reconstruction of the Hungnam chemical works in the 1950s. Entirely imaginary, I think, but that doesn't matter. It's about what it depicts and how it shows workers and so on. Obviously, everyone is just kind of very hard at work, and in the centre of it, there's a woman. I'd like to see the original painting of this to see more clearly what is going on. Maybe she's bringing lunch or something like that. I don't know. So, but this painting I think is relatively recent. It's actually from I think it's actually from the Hungnam factory itself, where there's a sort of exhibition of the history of the factory. One more image which I just put up because I particularly love this image, which is the amateur band or jazz band, I guess it is from looking at the instruments, of the Hwanghae Iron and Steel Works in the 1950s, taken in 1958. Again, another rather different picture of a new industrial working class enjoying their kind of leisure time, I suppose, or their organised fun, organised activities. Yeah. How long do I have? I'm trying to.
A few more minutes.
A few more minutes. Okay. Well, I'm going to try and conclude quickly. I probably said quite a lot of the things I wanted to say in my conclusion anyway. So. Okay, one thing that is probably necessary to state here quite clearly is that I don't think that the colonial state in Korea or the DPRK state in post-colonial Korea are equivalent in some sense. They're not the same sort of political regime. Obviously, they're very, very different, and they have very, very different aims and interests, and those differences are not sort of just at the level of ideology. I mean, they have real effects in the world in terms of how people view those states and how people live within them. And I think that's very important to take into account when you understand, what life was like and what the attitudes of workers were in the 1950s under the DPRK. By all accounts, workers did participate, more or less enthusiastically for a lot of the time in the reconstruction of the country. That's not to say there wasn't resistance to proletarianization and resistance to the conditions that existed, but the attitude of workers was no doubt very different to what it was in the late colonial period, because they were dealing with a very different political regime. Okay, so just to sum up some similarities and differences. The similarity between these two periods of proletarianization, first of all, labour conscription, I think, is a clear similarity. Both of them use this coercive mobilisation of workers. I think in both cases you see, major mobilisation of the rural population to become industrial workers. However, in the DPRK period, you see probably a larger surplus rural population being produced by the collectivisation. As I mentioned already, I think the gendering of proletarianisation was a bit different, because in the colonial period, although women were mobilised in various ways, they were not mobilised in large numbers for industry. And that's completely different in the DPRK, where women were mobilised. They were major subjects of mobilisation for industrial work. It would be interesting to trace that much further in North Korean history, because I believe that later that changed, and actually the DPRK state began to sort of move towards a much more traditional view of where women should be in society. When it comes to this question of immobilisation, again you see some very clear similarities. In both periods, it appears that mobility was used by workers as a form of sort of low-level resistance, leaving your job, trying to get one better one somewhere else, going back to your hometown, whatever. And in both cases, the response of the state was to try to fix workers in their jobs with these kind of coercive bureaucratic means, legislating against moving your job, and also bringing in these things like labour passports, which both regimes did. Okay, finally, just a few words about where this fits into, or where I think it fits into global labour history. I speculate then, or I'm going to put forward my opinion, which is not yet based on solid quantitative evidence, but that a very large proportion, perhaps a majority, of those who became industrial workers in mid-20th century Korea became industrial workers through the intervention of the state, whether it's the colonial state or the post-colonial state. Both of these states, in a certain sense, were practicing what we might call catch-up development, as well as participating in total wars. So I think that goes a long way to explain, that level of intervention by the state. A war in both cases became a very crucial factor that cemented state control of the economy as a whole, and also motivated this very direct state intervention in the process of making workers. And just to finish off, I suppose I find this something that really hasn't been looked at yet, so I think there's lots of potential for future research on it. One thing I really like to do, if I have time, if I have funding, if all the rest of those things, would be to actually try to do case studies of particular industrial complexes which go across the colonial, post-colonial divide, and see, how things changed and how workers' attitudes changed and how their experiences changed and so on. That's probably a very difficult, although I don't think impossible, project to carry out. So that's something I'd very much like to do. And another area I'd very much like to look in is this question of agricultural collectivisation. What does that actually mean? Is that in itself a kind of form of proletarianisation? Because that's, I know, something that has not really, I don't think, been looked at enough. That maybe has in other cases, but not in the Korean case yet. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.